All right. Well, it's a pleasure to welcome you all to our session, New Interactive Internet Approaches to Studying Eastern European Jewish Ashkenazic Music. My name is Judah Cohen. I'm at Indiana University right now, and it is a great pleasure to introduce our fantastic panel. I'll begin by reading the bios of all three of our panelists, and then we will go in the order of their introduction. Each of them will describe a fantastic project, and in fact, a project in which there is some interaction between our speakers as well. And it'll be exciting to hear what they have to say. I'll begin with our first speaker is Eleanor Biezunski, who has served as Associate Sound Archivist in the Max and Frida Weinstein Archives of the YIVO Sound Recordings since 2016. She is the project coordinator for the Ruth Rubin Legacy online exhibition, which you'll hear about, and a team member for the Klezmer Institute's Klezmer Archive and Kisselgoff-Makanovetsky Digital Manuscript Project, or the KMDMP, which you'll also hear about. She is a PhD candidate at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris and she's almost done, and she holds an MA in Urban Geography from the University of Paris Aix-Nanterre in France. She has published articles on Yiddish music and culture. She is also a fantastic singer and violinist, a band leader, and has collaborated with a large number of well-known Jewish performers here, being pretty much everywhere at this point, and abroad. Her recordings include the albums Yerusha and Soll Sein. She is also a recipient of an NYSCA, I believe that's the New York State Council of the Arts, Folk Arts Apprenticeship. Christina Crowder, our second speaker, has been performing and researching Jewish music for over 20 years, beginning in Budapest, Hungary in 1993, continuing with a Fulbright grant to Romania to document Jewish music in 1999, and since 2002 with an active research, teaching, and performing career in the United States. She is executive director of the Klezmer Institute, which has been awarded an NEH Digital Humanities Advancement Grant for 2021 to 22, which is a fantastic and very well-desired grant. Current projects include the compilation of a folio of Jewish adjacent Moldavian music and publication of selected field recordings from the Fulbright grant period. Christina lives in New Haven, Connecticut, and performs with her klezmer quartet, Bivolita. She also performs regularly with Michael Winograd and the honorable mention, the Goldenstein Compagnia and the Dave Levitt Klezmer Trio. She's been a guest instructor in klezmer accordion and ensemble performance in the US, Canada, and Europe, and was both musical director and performer in the 2019 Oregon Shakespeare Festival and the 2020 ART Portland productions of the Broadway play Indecent. Mark Slobin, our third presenter, is the Winslow Kaplan Professor of Music Emeritus at Wesleyan University and the author or editor of numerous books, including books on Afghanistan and Central Asia, Central European Jewish music, film music, and ethnomusicology theory, two of which have received the ASCAP Deems Taylor Award, those being Fiddler on the Move, Exploring the Klezmer World, and Tenement Songs, Popular Music of the Jewish Immigrants, both of which not only I know very well, but were a core part of my own education. Slobin's most recent book is Motor City Music, A Detroiter Looks Back. He has been president of the Society for Ethnomusicology and the Society for Asian Music, and is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Each presenter will have 20 minutes to present, after which I will give a quick response, about 10 minutes or so, and then we'll open up for questions. Let me start with Eleanor Biezunski.
Thank you so much, Judah, for this introduction, and thank you, Mark, for putting together this panel. I'm really honored to be part of it. Thank you also to the organizers of this conference. It's really wonderful to be able to share this. So I will present sort of a bit of a panoramic view of some projects that are going on now. The concept and the reality of an archive, especially a music archive, raise the question of what's old, what's new, and what's next. In other words, the creativity emanating towards, within, and from the archives. My doctoral dissertation focuses on observing the joint phenomenon of the creation of an archive and specifically the YIVO Sound Archive, also known as the Max and Frida Weinstein Archive of YIVO Sound Recordings, and the process of revitalizing a music perceived as threatened or moribund, to name it the klezmer music revival, so-called revival of the 1970s and 1980s. Howard Baker, in Outworlds, underlines the major role of organizations in artistic change. For a music revival to take place, musicians and scholars need to work together with organizations to create the institutional structures that will support their research and their creativity. This is specifically the dynamic that led to the creation of the YIVO Sound Archive. It can be compared with the revitalization of Jewish music in Russia at the turn of the 20th century, especially in St. Petersburg around the Society for Jewish Folk Music, whose objectives were, according to Irene Heskes, to collect and arrange Jewish popular melodies, to present lectures and performances of this material, to establish and maintain an archive or library of Jewish music, to publish a journal, and to encourage individual creativity in the domain of Jewish music. In both cases, the creation of an archive is an integral part of the process of revitalizing a music, thanks to both an effort of collecting the necessary sources as well as the access the archive then provides to them. The revitalization or revival can only perdure, and in case of klezmer music, transition into a post-revival phase within the context of a support network, which in our case includes educational and performance channels, such as Klez Camp, created in 1985 in the YIVO Sound Archive, and other festivals. In this sense, the interactivity of the archives is not a new phenomenon. On the contrary, understood as a living space of imagination and creativity, the archive provides a ground to cultural activities beyond its physical space. The term archive can designate both a container, the place where one goes to consult stored document, a location, and its content, the document themselves. Thus, the archive is both a real space and a metonymic space. The evolution of recording formats and mostly of information technologies and methodologies in libraries and archives has profoundly modified the way archives can be accessed, preserved, used, and experienced by a wider than ever audience. The archivist thus emerges as a figure, the major actor of the archive, at times the guardian of sacred relics, the manufacturer and cartographer of knowledge, the servant of the institution and its users, and in the case of the YIVO Sound Archive, also an artist, sometimes an activist, if not a political one, at least a cultural one. And on the one hand, the archivists participate in this mode of cultural production that Barbara Kirschenblatt-Gimblett calls heritage. That is to say, I quote, a new mode of cultural production in the present that has recourse to the past, end of quote. On the other hand, looking into the future, archivists must anticipate the needs for future access and the way to make this access perennial through catalogs, preservation formats, both physical and digital. Following Niamh Moore, we consider here the archive as a process and not as an inert object. I quote, the concept of an archival imaginary suggests that it is not merely that archives are sites where social science knowledge can be produced or social science methods can be applied, but also that the archival imaginary is constitutive of the possibilities for knowledge making, end of quote. In today's YIVO Sound Archive, a lot of efforts have been made to make accessible some important collections of field recordings, especially of Yiddish folk songs. The Ruth Rubin Legacy website that I coordinated was released in 2018, and it has seen an increase in its use during the pandemic in 2020. Ruth Rubin was born in 1906 and grew up in Montreal. Her family was from Chotin in Bessarabia. She devoted her life to the collection and preservation of Yiddish folklore, poetic and musical. She collected around 2,500 songs and interviews from groups and individuals, and published books, songbooks, and articles, presented conference papers and lecture recitals, and was a prolific recording artist in her own right. The centerpiece of the Ruth Rubin Archive, held at YIVO Institute for Jewish Research, is Rubin's 135-volume collection of field recordings, assembled from 78 RPM acetate discs. You can see one on the bottom left here. Reel-to-reel tapes and cassettes recorded by Rubin from 1946 through the 1970s. The archive also contains sound documents of Rubin's numerous lectures, concerts, and radio interviews, as well as personal notebooks, articles, manuscripts, correspondence, books, and records. Its interactivity is mostly twofold. The crowdsourcing features in the website allows for people to contribute with their transcriptions, transliteration, or additional information on the song or the performer. This feature has been used, among others, by teachers as an educational tool. The new recording section of the site features another aspect of the interactivity of such a collection, which pertains to its use in the wider world as a basis for creating new works, performances, and recordings. A third use of the collection, facilitated by its access online, is the study of Yiddish songs, such as the work coordinated by Mark Slobin on the Inside the Yiddish Folk Song website. Another important collection is the YIVO Folk Song Project, East European Jewish folk song in its social context. This project was created and led by Barbara Kirschenblatt-Gimblet in the early 1970s. The project was intended to be at the cutting edge of ethnographic practices and was based on the research collections and publications of the pioneering ethnomusicologist Moishe Beregovsky, who I will talk more about in a short moment. The collection was nevertheless based on two new principles compared to what had been done until then with Yiddish songs. First, the collection of the repertoire of the singers chosen for the project had to be exhaustive. Second, as Barbara Kirschenblatt-Gimblet told me in an interview, I quote, "These interviews would provide the fullest reach as possible, not just context, but the singers' understanding of the songs themselves and of the situations in which they sang them. Where they first heard them, when they first learned them, where and when they sang them, for whom, what these songs meant to them." End of quote. This process involved many hours of interviews with some of the most important Yiddish folk singers of the 20th century, such as Mariam Nierenberg and Lifshitz Widman. The project also had a pedagogical dimension, since a group of graduate students was trained for the project as part of two seminars, from the conception of the project to the presentation of the results and the referencing of the archive. Created from the beginning with the awareness that this documentation was going to be archived, the collection of the material had to be done in a rigorous manner, given the large mass of material generated by the project. The paper documentation accompanying the project shows the care given to the preparation of the questionnaires and to the in-depth reflection on the way to carry out this completely new survey, which was nevertheless inspired by the expedition carried out by Ansky in the villages and towns of Ukraine at the beginning of the 20th century. This collection is currently being digitized in its entirety thanks to a grant obtained in 2020 by YIVO from the Council on Library and Information Resources, and will be available to the public in 2022 through the search portal of the YIVO archives. The pandemic of 2020 has made it necessary to modify the workflow compared to the usual archival processing, which aspect I won't get into details now, but I'm happy to discuss it later if someone is interested. And the pandemic has also changed the way archives function, and the demand for digitized material has become stronger and stronger. The interactivity of the archives, which started before the pandemic, thanks to new technologies and the internet, has become even stronger in the realm of Jewish music through a few projects. Furthermore, musicians from around the world interested in Jewish music suddenly found themselves stranded at home, deprived of touring. They had an opportunity to bring to the forefront some activities that they hadn't been able to prioritize until then, including the study of other sources of klezmer music, and in particular, the work of Moshe Beregovsky. Moshe Beregovsky was a major pioneer of Jewish ethnomusicology. He is credited for introducing the term klezmer to refer to the style of music rather than to the musicians. among other things. Between 1929 and 1947, he was the only person to collect recordings of Jewish music on wax cylinders in Ukraine, except for Sofia Magid, but she was working in another region and independently in St. Petersburg. By the mid-1940s, he had amassed 7,000 musical documents, including the cylinders from the Ansky expedition and Zusman Kisselgov's collection, which he catalogued. His archive was thought to have been destroyed during the Second World War, but it was found in the Vernadsky Library in Kiev in the mid-1990s by, among others, Lyudmila Sholokhova, who catalogued it. Only a part of the 5 volumes he prepared for publication were published, including by Mark Slobin in 1981. And the melody he collected have been used and performed by contemporary musicians since already 2 or 3 decades, in fact. During the 2020 pandemic, new collaborative projects were a late ripple effect of the Jewish musical revival in Russia from the early 20th century into the present. A few initiatives took place over Zoom starting in April 2020. The violinist Craig Yudelman, stranded by European confinements while touring with his partner, the singer Sacha Lourier, in Scotland at the home of Michael Alpert, a leading multi-instrumentalist, NEH fellow, and translator of Berezovsky, wanted to open up the conversations they were having to the community of those who might be interested and able to contribute. So he created a Facebook group that he named Berezovsky Online Forum and organized a series of Zoom roundtables on the repertoire collected and studied by Berezovsky and his reissues, and also his reissues with experts. The archives of these roundtables are hosted on the website of the Klezmer Institute, an organization created in 2018 by Christina Crowder, Clara Bayom, and Zev Feldman, aimed at the study, preservation, and dissemination of Ashkenazi expressive culture. In parallel, London-based violinist Ilana Kravitz, author of, among other things, a klezmer violin manual, launched an international project involving 35 violinists to explore, revisit, record, and share pieces from an unpublished volume of Berezovsky's Nigunim, which are wordless melodies. In addition to this, each participant was scheduled in a series of daily Zoom concerts called A Nigun a Day, broadcast live on Facebook and archived on YouTube, aimed at presenting this material and more. I myself had the honor to participate in this project as a violinist. This project prompted accordionist Ilya Schneeweis to create a Google spreadsheet, humorously titled Berezovsky and the City, to collectively cross-reference the sources of the pieces collected by Moshe Berezovsky, whether published in print, part of Berezovsky's manuscripts, or as sound recordings, both historically and contemporary. Members of the klezmer community contributed to this initiative, including librarian and researcher Daniel Karchner, author of or contributor to numerous Wikipedia entries on historical klezmer figures, and creator of the YouTube channel Classic Klezmer, an almost indispensable resource of historical klezmer recordings. Inspired by these initiatives, I started a reading group in Yiddish called Lehenkreis, so Berezovsky Lehenkreis, motivated by the desire to read together with others Moshe Berezovsky's Yiddish article, Jiddische Klezmer, Zeyer Schaffen und Steger, an article published in 1941 in Moscow. So I simply suggested on the Facebook page that Craig Yudelman had created on the Berezovsky Online Forum, who wants to read this with me? And I was immediately joined by a group of enthusiasts, including David Zakalik, a biologist at Cornell University, but more importantly, musician, passionate klezmer composer, and Yiddish translator, who volunteered to host the Zoom meetings, as well as to type up our collective translation as we went along, and Uri Schretter, a doctoral student in musicology at Harvard, who took the initiative of keeping a journal of our discussions, tentatively titled Glossary, including the discussions on particular terms or themes addressed by Berezovsky that had sparked conversation within the group. The collegial and somewhat informal nature of these virtual encounters has attracted and retained over the months a group that includes both some of the greatest specialists in klezmer and Jewish music, as well as passionate amateurs whose presence may have been motivated solely by curiosity, and all contributed their knowledge to the group's discussions, which shed light on the text that brought us together. The nearly 30 Sunday sessions in 2020, during which we completed the reading of this first article, never saw fewer than 12 to 15 participants, and by early 2021, the group was hovering between 20 and 25 weekly participants, or almost weekly. An English translation by Michael Alpert of the Russian version of this article was published in 2015 in Kurt Berling's reprint of Berezovsky's book, Jewish Instrumental Folk Music. We then began the arduous task of reading the article, another article by Berezovsky published earlier in 1932 in Kiev. In parallel, the conversation about the sources of Jewish music, the different versions of the pieces and their circulation from one tradition to another, etc., were animated for months in a private Facebook chat that I had created when we started our meetings called Reading Berezovsky in Yiddish. So I will end this presentation by talking briefly about a few more projects, including very briefly the KMDMP, but you will hear more about this directly from Christina. So this is a crowdsourcing project born around the online publication of the manuscripts of the Kyselgov-Makonovetsky collection, the original notebooks of the Ansky expedition found in the National Vernadsky Library of Ukraine. But I will just say that in addition to the digitally notated tunes from the manuscripts that you will hear more about, other resources have been created from the collected data, such as cartographic representations of the provenance of the pieces, visual glossary, presenting musical signs encountered in the manuscripts, to name a few, to enable collaborative work on this manuscript. There is also now a YouTube playlist compiling videos produced by musicians from the digitized materials in the collection and other projects starting from there. Other notable works on early sources of klezmer music include that conducted by the clarinetist and band leader Zisław Slepowicz with Sacha Laurier for the Fortunoff Video Archive for the Holocaust testimony at Yale University. I want to mention also the collaboration between Jonathan Malin, musicologist at the University of Colorado Boulder, and the violinist Alicia Svigals on the Berezovsky Archive project as part of the residency supported by Archive Transformed, a creative residency created by the late David Schneer that was created to allow artists and scholars to work together on archival-based artistic projects. So to conclude, what has become increasingly clear in the course of this study is the eminently living character of Jewish music archives. Archives appear as a social place where community is constructed, where the assembly of documents is, I quote Lane and Hill, 2010, is not a static and stable construction, but rather a fluid concept that changes according to the interactions of archivists and users, end of quote. Consequently, archives are only fully realized in their exploitation. This kind of intertextuality ricochets endlessly as new works are created, not only in a play of reference to the archives, but also generating new archives, cut in new contexts that transform both their nature and their impact. New technological media and means of production, new networks, new channels of transmissions, and always history in motion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eleanor. Let's turn over now to Christina for your paper. And Christina, you should unmute, please.
Great. Thank you so much, Judah. Thanks, Eleanor. I'm going to pick up literally right where you left off, actually. And thank you for serving up the Kisselhoff project. I've just dropped into the chat a link to the text of this presentation, a more formal sort of textual presentation. But I'm going to read off, sort of talk about these projects based on these slides, rather than reading the paper. Klezmer Institute has 2 digital humanities projects that are interconnected and that sort of feed each other. And so I'd like to talk about a little bit about both of them. The Klezmer Archive project aims to create a universally accessible, useful resource for interaction, discovery, and research on all of the available information about klezmer music. The Kisselhoff-Makoniewiecki Digital Manuscript Project, or short form KMDMP, is a digital humanities collaboration that connects musicians today, klezmer musicians today, and scholars today directly with klezmer musicians from more than 100 years ago. And I've sort of, to directly pick up where Eleanor left off, we began these projects working from the proposition that klezmer music is in a post-revival period. And so that, we're basing our work on the idea that klezmer music and the Yiddish language are centers for thriving contemporary communities. They're not in need of revival, they have been revived. And so we are going from there. And so that our imperative is to create digital structures that suit the needs and interests of these communities, at the same time that they fit into the structures of archives, traditional structures of archives, libraries, and so forth. I was speaking to Sherry Mehrant just the other day and talking about the Klezmer Archive project, and she mentioned that the idea of a way to search klezmer music inside the music and to collect all of this information together has been on the minds of klezmer musicians and scholars since the very beginning of the revival. And as we were speaking about briefly at the beginning of our session, we've come to realize that the realm of instrumental klezmer music is vast. There is a lot of music available to us now that we weren't aware of in the past. And so part of our problem now, part of our work now, is to organize and understand that music in its vastness, as opposed to thinking only from a position of scarcity. And so our digital tools are best put to use in serving the purpose of extending individual memory. And this is a particular challenge for musicians. This is a slightly different challenge than for text applications. And so the Klezmer Archive project centers itself on capturing this knowledge in a useful way within the digital space. One of the particular issues that we encounter and that we are grappling with, in addition, is the idea that a traditional archive or library structure will document the item or the artifact, but they don't document or make available for search what is inside of that. And what I mean by that, we can say that there is a recording of a piece of music, and we might be able to hear it now in digital humanities. We're sometimes able to hear that piece of music, like with the Ruth Rubin Archive. But our aim is to make that music inside of that artifact itself searchable. And the last part on this is that the Kisselhoff project interacts with the Klezmer Archive project in the sense that this project I'll talk about later, the Kisselhoff project, is the test corpus for the archive. So as I mentioned before, our aim in this project is to create a universally accessible, useful research for interaction about and discovery on klezmer music. I'm going to step back a moment and just talk a little bit about how this project came to be. At Yiddish New York several years ago, I was walking down the street, going to lunch with a colleague, and we were talking about this idea about the Klezmer Archive, and another friend of ours tapped us on the shoulder and said, "Hey, what are you talking about?" And we were talking about this dream of creating a digital humanities resource that would collect everything we know about klezmer music into one place. And we had a very fateful and very productive luncheon shortly after Yiddish New York that got us on the pathway to creating this tool, and that led to an application to the NEH to actually do the project. So this philosophy and design part of this slide comes from the crystallization of the ideas around this project that went into the NEH application. So we wanted to create a tool that, as I was mentioning before I got kicked out of here, something that bridges the gap between oral history and an archive structure. We wanted to reconnect or connect directly practitioners and culture bearers with this digital tool in a way that we hadn't seen yet. And we know that these tools are on the horizon, but we wanted to actually go do the work of creating them ourselves. And once again, for music, we wanted to open up this black box where we have the archive not simply describing the item, but allowing us to search inside of it. And this leads to the idea of facilitating engagement by musicians as they interact in the archival space. Another huge opportunity here is the possibility to use computational musicology tools to understand more deeply and in ways that have never before been possible the scope and range of Ashkenazic klezmer music. One thing that we have discovered over the first 9 months of work on the Klezmer Archive project is that we believe that we can build this tool using existing technology. We do not have to invent anything that does not already exist in the world. However, the tool that we are planning to build does go beyond the current state of the art in digital humanities. And so that's an exciting edge to be on. And we're hoping to be able to report back more on that aspect of the project in the future. Our project design for this tool has been designed around building user experience research from the beginning of the project. And that user experience, because we're designing for musicians and culture bearers as users, that we're building user experience research into the beginning of the project. We have discovered through this initial research that our desired tool will be open to everybody, built on open source principles. It will be accessible, not behind a paywall. It will be accessible to anybody who wants to use it. That this tool, in addition to archiving and collecting information, will also be a tool that is available for outreach to people who have not yet become fans of klezmer music and who don't know about this music. We want to create a site that will be a useful place for analysis of klezmer music and the klezmer music corpus. And we have an imperative to create a space that is an authoritative reference on this topic. Of course, to be able to search for things, you need to have a well-organized space. And we, through the process of creating this space, will be helping to establish standardizing certain components of the music or certain ways of describing the music, which is a process that's not without complications. We want to create domain-specific, corpus-specific metadata that can be used to describe our corpus. And of course, a good archive is always curated. This archival tool will incorporate many different ways of viewing the items that are collected within its space. One way that we're thinking about, one view that we've approached is a way to display an original manuscript alongside a pitch map, for example, and alongside a digitally reproduced score. That's one view that's very useful for musicians to be able to access the music. And it's a way of preserving editorial control between an original manuscript source and a digital source. But when we're talking about adding layers of complexity that has to do with community members and culture bearers, one of the views that we've considered is a way of what we call the Talmudic view, in which we would center, instead of a central piece of text, we would have a central piece of item of music. And it would be surrounded by traditional catalog and location information, corpus-specific metadata, and tune-specific information. And it would also display what we call relationship or semantic metadata as well. But alongside this piece of music, we would also create a space for commentary by people who would like to have something to say specifically about this piece of music and how it fits into a larger whole. Now, of course, if you have many thousands of pieces of music, not every piece of music will have commentary on it, but there will certainly be some pieces of music and some groups of pieces of music that will attract, we believe, a great deal of attention. And those, the idea of being able to not create simply a narrative, a singular narrative, where there can only be one truth. If we consider the Wikidata, a Wikipedia article is edited to become one single narrative. And as any Jewish scholar will know, that the Talmud is about having competing ideas or ideas being represented that may or may not be in conflict and tension with each other. And we think that's actually extremely valuable. Presenting differing opinions coexistent with each other are very useful. And we're trying to figure out for this tool how we can display these kinds of commentary in a way that highlights the knowledge of specific culture bearers while still preserving the opportunity for newcomers and less experienced people to also be able to contribute to the discussion. And the short version of that approach is about giving weight and ranking to certain community members, either based by their scholarly achievement or by frequency of contributions and community ratings and so like this. Our project, the project as designed, is informed by industry in a way that we think is worth highlighting. Our programming team all works in the world of programming for outside of the academy, and that agile project management and agile project design is, to the extent that it can be, informing our process. And we think that that's a valuable thing to carry with us as we iterate going forward over the next several years. In 2020, we were awarded a National Endowment for the Humanities Digital Humanities Advancement Grant for this project. We are about halfway through the project period. And at the end of the granting period, we are going to be producing a plan for what we call the MVP, the minimum viable product. The minimum viable product is an industry term that is used to describe a plan for all of the essential components that this tool needs to have in order to fulfill its mission to be this universal digital resource for the study and collection of klezmer music. We are hoping that as Barbara Kirshenblatt-Gimblett has written for us, that this will help to advance the recognition of klezmer music, Jewish music, and klezmer music specifically as a location of serious academic study moving forward. And we're hoping to build a tool that, as Mark points out in his quote here, that that we can use this tool and build a tool that will be useful for contemporary communities to be in touch with people in the past, and to capture the knowledge, capture the knowledge of our culture bearers. Dan Shanahan wrote to say that, and we agree that this is true, that if we are successful in our work, we will succeed in creating a model for musics of oral tradition and folk musics to create digital archive spaces that capture the knowledge of culture bearers in the same way that we do for klezmer music. So moving on to the Kisselhoff-Makaniewicz digital project. This is a digital humanities project that has been founded to connect contemporary musicians with klezmer musicians from more than 100 years ago through handwritten musical manuscripts that were collected during the Ansgi expeditions of 1912 to 1914. This was designed as a low-cost, volunteer-driven project to use, easily accessible, also free platforms such as Google Drive, Facebook, and Google Groups, along with a very simple web page. The idea is that we had been given access to about 850 high-resolution photographs of music manuscripts from the Vernadsky National Library of Ukraine, and we wanted to make them available to the public right from the very beginning. That was given to us as sort of an imperative for this project. But the project itself was unfunded, and we didn't quite know how it was going to work, so we just built it up from scratch using what we had to hand. I'm very happy to report that in its first year, this project has attracted more than 200 registered participants, and almost a little bit more than half of the corpus has been digitally notated. So a little bit about this corpus. What we have are 850 high-resolution scans. This covers 26 notebooks of handwritten music from the Ansgi expeditions. We have Moshe Beregovsky's handwritten catalog of the material, and about 200 pages of the wedding manuscript of Avram Yeshia Makaniewicz. This encompasses about 1,400 melodies, different melodies. Along with the melodies, we have handwritten text of all varieties in Russian, in Yiddish, sometimes in Italian, and sometimes even in German. And the work of the project is to digitally notate the music on the manuscript pages, and then to translate the text also into digital format, first to transliterate in its original language, and then to translate into English, and to make all of this available in a digital space. Doing so will allow us to disseminate this material much more easily than it's possible to do in these sort of hard to read handwritten pages. Also, the digitization process allows us to make the music and the material available for further digital computational musicology research, and also for making critical editions, player folios, and so on. All of these documents were shared with permission from the Institute of Manuscripts at the Vernadsky National Library of Ukraine. All of the project materials are shared freely in publicly accessible PDF form and are licensed under Creative Commons Attribution licensing. This project is unfolding in 3 phases. First part, with the launch of the project in November 2020, we completed phase 1, which is to disseminate and make available the material. Phase 2 is what we are doing now, digitize and translate. This is what's happening in our Zoom rooms and other events throughout the year. And with a partnership with Yiddish Summer Weimar this year, we have moved into phase 3 as well, which is to analyze, perform, and transform this music. I was part of the traditional ensemble at Yiddish Summer Weimar, and there was also a new Jewish music ensemble at Yiddish Summer Weimar that took material from this Kisselhoff collection and made new compositions and new arrangements around it. The work of the project happens in Zoom rooms. Inspired by the coronavirus lockdowns, we've been able to gather together on Zoom where people talk about translation, we play tunes together, and we have kept interest in this project going through a series of Digitize-a-thon marathons where we have Zoom rooms that are open for anywhere from 8 to 30 hours.
Christina, you're at the end of your time.
Okay.
So I want to know if you want to take one last
swing at this. The things that I would like to say is that one of the great payoffs of working in this very open, volunteer-driven sort of space is that we've been seeking to create open, non-hierarchical structures. And we have found that working in these structures has been uplifting for women and for gender non-binary voices. And we find that to be extremely valuable. And that, especially during the coronavirus times, these Zoom spaces have been a way to build community at a time when people have been isolated. And we also value the idea that this kind of work has flattened the distance between sort of highfalutin scholars and people who are oftentimes inaccessible to those who are newcomers to the genre and who are new practitioners. And we also find that to be very valuable. So with that, I'll close. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Christina. Again, these are two fantastic presentations, and now I'm looking forward to our third presenter, Mark Slobin.
Hi, thanks to Christina and Eleanor for their presentations. I'm going to take a different angle on the enormous spectrum of projects that have come out of this reconsideration of the massively heroic work that was, whoops, well, I don't need that quite yet. I didn't ask for the slides yet. Could we go back? Well, that's all right. Oh no. Now what happens? I'm no longer speaker view.
It's okay. We can still hear you, Mark. So yeah, why don't you go ahead?
Along this path that has gone on since around 1900, one thing that was left out, particularly for the Yiddish folk song, was any analytical work whatsoever. This separates the Yiddish heritage of song from all European folk song traditions. Take, for example, the pioneering work of Bartók, which strongly influenced non-Jewish scholarship all over Central and Southeastern Europe. But the Yiddish corpus remained a blank slate for analysis. In the 1980s, there was this little tiny bit of energy. You saw a picture that Eleanor showed of the record album that I did with Barbara Kirshenblad Gimblett, one album with annotations, and I wrote one article, and that's it. In 2019, a small group of us began to talk about the resurgence of creative interest in the Yiddish folk song. This is not about klezmer. This is about the Yiddish folk song by some really very young people, what you call Generation Z even. This came out from seeds planted by the late Adrian Cooper, by Josh Waletsky, by Ethel Rehm, Michael Alpert, people who have been giving intensive workshops on structure, style, and performance at gatherings such as Yiddish Summer Weimar, Klez Canada, Yiddish New York. The work of Walter Zev Feldman with dance and klezmer dovetailed with the idea of research in song. And we are joined by Itzik Gottesman from the Yiddish song nobility family of the Schechters and Gottesmans, who has been putting out a project called Yiddish Song of the Week for many years. That has been very helpful all around. The Center for Traditional Music and Dance in New York City, founded by Ethel Rehm, is run now by Pete Ruszewski, who is a klezmer specialist. So he gave us that organization's umbrella to create a website called yiddishfolksong.com that you can all go to and get the details of. So I'm just going to introduce that website briefly. here. The motto of the website is Auf den Weg steht ein Lied, which is a kind of reference to the well-known song Auf den Weg steht ein Baum, a Yiddish song. A tree stands along the way, and we change it to a song is along the way. The website has four principal aims: to position the folk song within Yiddish expressive culture. What do we mean by folk song? First of all, what is the body that we're dealing with? To provide hitherto unknown resources for study that are now all online, to present profiles of selected Yiddish folk singers, but most centrally to offer new approaches to analysis. To set the stage, Zev Feldman wrote a first ever essay placing the folk song within the broader context of expressive culture of the Ashkenazic Eastern European Jews. Newly added resources include remarkable 1920s essay that we ran into by Mikhail Gnesin, courtesy of Izali Zemtsovsky, long research essays by collaborators and others with Barbara's project of the Yivo Yiddish Folk Song Project, Toby Dodkin-Bloom and Janet Leuchter, a terrific bibliography of the Yiddish folk song done by Michael Lukin, and Barbara Kirschbad-Gimblet's groundbreaking 1973 lecture, and so forth. But I want to get to the heart of the matter, music analysis, and briefly introduce you to the idea and show you some what we've done. Earlier work like this, even by the great Ruth Rubin and by Bierogovsky and other such people, tended to sort songs into genres. Like a mailman working in an apartment house, like in my building in New York, the mailman comes and he sorts it out into boxes. What analysis wants to know is what's in those letters. That's where people voice their thoughts and create texts. Okay? So the text here can be a written transcription, which is itself not really the letter. It's like somebody transcribing your letter, or a documentary recording. But that's, analysis itself is a commentary on text, which is something Christina brought up, and it's a deeply Jewish practice. This is extremely complicated for music because what is the text? Music is a bundle of parameters that vary, that in itself is a bundle. It's not like one set of, written words. It's four basic parameters, which are pitch, which is the vibrations per second, which go into melodies. It is timbre, which is the color and the texture of the song. It is intensity, the dynamic level of the song, and also majorly duration, how the singer organizes time into a memorable unit of feeling. All of these parameters influence each other and are filtered through a given singer's consciousness and their own personal profile. A folk song, as an object, welds music with language temporarily, creating a cognitive unit that sticks in the mind and can be circulated. Then, without an original, unlike many Jewish texts that needed original for starters, this can circulate through minds in many different ways. I want to offer examples of two approaches we took on this website, inside YiddishFolksong.com. One is by Josh Waletsky, the other Ethel Raines' work. Josh wrote a 76-page essay, which is a magnum opus. It focuses only on duration, which is shaped into rhythm and meter. Okay, Ethel worked on the live embodiment of the singer's aesthetic, the way that people embody their aesthetic and feeling of a song in a performance, and how you can analyze that. Okay, so Josh started actually his life as a graduate student in structural linguistics, and he authored a seminal article on Yiddish with Uriel Weinreich, a great star in Yiddish studies. I want to point out just a couple of things about Josh's essay that are innovative. First of all, he has rethought the idea of genre, starting from performance, okay, rather than like the topic of a song. Is it a children's song? Is it a war song? Is it what kind of song is it? He introduced a trio of Yiddish terms. It was incredibly useful for thinking about the Yiddish folk song. And he made up these three Yiddish terms, which is from the inside out. Then. The first is zogevdik. A song can be zogevdik or speakingly, okay, which Bartok would have called something like parlando rubato or some stuffy term that's opaque. Zogevdik is very, very clear in Yiddish. I'll give you an example of a Zogedick song. Soll ich seine Rolle, kenn ich nicht kein Teure. Soll ich seine Säure, hab ich nicht kein Säure. Und die Räder drehen sich, und die Jahre gehen sich, und die Weib stillt sich, und ein bisschen Band von Wild sich. Seh ich mir a stehen, sie seh mich wein. This is Zogedick. It's about telling something, okay? And where the text, the duration is guided by text. At the other end, we have Tanzdick, which is dancingly, and songs that are connected to dance, talk about dance, or you could dance to, okay? So here's an example. Schwarze Kasche reißt man, grüne was man stehen. Die seine Mädelach nimmt man, die Miese was man gehen. This is a Tanzdick. What we've been concentrating on is in between these two, which he calls Zingevdick, singingly. It's in a singing way, okay? And the essay is based, his whole essay is based on the analysis of one song. We used to sit around a table in my apartment for sessions in which we would spend 3 hours working on one aspect of this song, meet again 5-6 weeks later, spend another 3 hours thinking about this one song, okay? And this is a lyrical song of the kind that women created and circulated in their networks. And often about the problems of life, often about deep unhappiness related to love situations. So this song is von Gois Dasad. It was recorded, it's on the record that Ruth Rubin put out in early 1960s on Folkways. So you can all hear this thing by going to the Ruth Rubin archive, for example, at YIVO. Von Gois Dasad leg ich sich schlafen, und meine Hand leg ich zu Kopfen, und auf alles hab ich Harote, aber zurück kann ich nicht haben. This is a quatrain, it's 4 lines. The next quatrain starts, zurück kann ich nicht haben. The nature of this particular verse structure is that each stanza starts where the last one left off, which is a really intricate, complex musical composition that some unknown people put together, women put together, okay? Each of the 4 lines is internally extremely complex in its text and its melodic micro units, okay? In this version that I've given you of this song, the first and second lines have certain melodic similarities. The third line is extremely different. The fourth line resembles the first and second, but ends ends the whole thing and wraps it up and gives it a punchline. So the levels of complexity of this song really nurtured us for really months on end. So I want to just give you a couple ideas of the analytical innovations that Josh has used. Okay, and we can have the first slide now. Ivana, can you give me the first slide? There it is. Okay, in this thing, he has done the first line of the song, and what you're seeing, you see these numbers? Here's the text, Von Gois.
Hey, Mark, I see the slide if you want to continue.
Sorry? You have Von Gois Dasad leg ich schlafen, okay? And you've got the pulses listed, Von Gois, and then pulse with no text and Dasad. And what he's done is the pulse durations in milliseconds.
Just checking, Mark, are you there? I'm not hearing you right yet.
I don't know what to tell you.
I can hear Mark fine.
I don't know. So what you're seeing are milliseconds. As it happens, in human...
For the moment, let's double check one more time. Christina, Eleanor, are you hearing me and not Mark?
I'm hearing both of you.
Okay.
I hear Mark also.
Okay, so I assume that everybody's hearing me. Ivana, if there's a problem, will you let me know?
There you are.
It turns out that milliseconds are important in our perception, okay? This is thousandths of a second, shorter than a blink of an eye. We have found that it is several milliseconds. As human beings, we recognize a song, we recognize its timbre and even its emotion within a very, very tiny bit. So actually doing for the first time empirical study, quantitative empirical study of the Yiddish folk song is one of the things that Josh has done, which is a major step forward, because now we understand how long each of these pulses really is as she lays them out in real time, which tells us something about how we understand and perceive this song. Okay, that's one thing. I want to do one more set of things. This will only take a short time, maybe about another 10 minutes or so. He also, in addition to these quantitative systems, he uses qualitative systems of analysis through metaphors. He invents thought experiments to understand how do we shape time, how does the singer shape time, and how do we respond to that. Could I have the next slide? Okay, the next slide. Yes. Okay. So this is a staff notation, which shows you, by the way, how compared to that millisecond analysis, you've got, like, even if you don't know music, you can see it's very reduced. Okay. So Joss invented this little device for figuring out how we understand the grouping. Okay, by using a Yiddish word. There's a Yiddish word der Letz, which means a joker. Okay, and then there's the Yiddish word der Letzte, which means the last one. And so if we use der Letz and der Letzte Letz, which would be the last of the clowns, the last jester, we can try to recite that with this first line. So we get der Letz, der Letz, der Letz, der Letz, der Letz. Now, that turns out to be one way of reading how this is organized. But you could read it also differently. You could read der Letz, der Letz, der Letz, der Letz, der Letz. Okay, so there are many different ways you could read this. And so if you see the next slide, Josh has given us in his essay. Can I have the next slide? Okay, he's given us 16 ways to parse this line using der Letz and der Letzte. So I can't go into this now, but this is true of all music. What he's pointing out is that it's a very important innovative analysis for, say, the Yiddish folk song, that it is ambiguous. What a singer is doing is at each moment coming to a fork in the road and saying, I want to do it this way. Okay? This is true just as true for Bach. Say a Bach piece that I learned to play on the violin many, many years. So it can be played this way. Ya da da dee da 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 dee da 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 dee da da da. Or you can sing that da 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 dee da 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 dee da 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 dee da da da. That's how the subtlety of interpreting Bach. Okay, Bach made it possible by the way he wrote it that you could have different ways of understanding the piece. And what Josh is saying is that's what Yiddish folk songs are like. Okay, and it's the richness is about an ambiguity in all these parameters. And what the analyst wants to do is not make a bunch of little analytical squares the way Bartók did with Hungarian folk songs, but to point to the richness, the ambiguity built into interpretation of song by live singers. So in the last couple of minutes, I want to show you Ethel Raines' approach to this, which extends it farther into live performance by singers. Ethel grew up in the Yiddish song tradition, and she knew all the major old singers, and she can at will perform all the ways that singers perform the different lines in different ways that I've just laid out for you as being possibilities. She is an absolute virtuoso at this, and she has been teaching people so that her pedagogy is analytical, but not analytical this way. It's analytical in terms of producing in your own body and embodying this thing. I'm going to show you two clips of Ethel teaching an apprentice of that are on our website. So could I have the first video clip? Okay, we're going to see two clips that are like 1 minute each. Ethel is teaching Eleanor Weil, who like Eleanor Buzinski. We have two Eleanors who came from Paris to study Yiddish music in New York, which is quite extraordinary. So she is teaching on this Master Apprentice program of New York State Council of the Arts. Ethel is teaching her. So I want to show you two small clips, and here she is.
Stoß die Liebe, Ingerheit mir sie doch stark, stark. So,
She's going to, okay, so they're going to
Just a-
dissect this
just a
one
kind,
little section. I'm sorry, it stopped right.
Apologies, just a kind request to put your mic on mute while I play the video, then we will have a better audio quality just for this minute. Thank you.
So you can put the second note in sie spielt nicht, or in sie spielt nicht aus die Liebe. In sie spielt nicht aus die Liebe. And the other one, the first one was in sie spielt nicht. In sie spielt nicht aus die Liebe. Linger heißt mir sie doch starben. In sie spielt nicht aus die Liebe. Jinger heit mir sie doch starben. Beautiful.
Okay, so what you heard was Ethel suggesting there are two ways to do this. Okay, and so that's an analysis that she is offering. Okay, Eleanor. In the other little clip is about this is sort of this multiple interpretation model. Okay? In the second clip, she dissects a line and shows that the force of the expression of this line comes from a very tiny melodic gesture that she calls a scoop. Without that scoop, the line isn't right. Okay, and Eleanor says, I don't come from a scoop culture, because she's coming from classical music, from French folk music and other traditions. In normal analytical writing, this scoop would be called an ornament or an embellishment. But what is being pointed out here is that this kind of tiny unit is actually structural. So this is another analytical approach, and maybe you can hear this. Again, it just takes 1 minute to listen to. And I'll turn my mic off.
So there's a way of getting some emphasis without kind of blurting it out. And part of that is to like just have that tiny little dip up to the note, and that will give it the emphasis without it blurting out. Put in a tiny little slide there, because that's what will give that the emphasis that you want. It's so tiny.
That's in the middle of the word.
That's good. That's
very natural. Wait, I'm not from a scoop culture.
Okay, so I think you could hear that. Okay, the importance of how you get to a note. So this is another kind of analysis, you see, that we're introducing on the website. And for a more general view of style, I'll close with a slide of an outline that Ethel and I put together of, and this is the last slide, of what kinds of things do you look for in a given singer's embodiment of a folk song. The last slide, yeah. Text articulation, melodic variation, breath, voice quality, and intensity. And you see within each one of these, there are, you see how many parameters there are in trying to understand a folk song. Okay. Text articulation includes the pronunciation of the text, including dialect, the projecting of the feeling of that text, the implicit meter, the flexibility, how the meter is compressed and extended, and the phrasing. This is all articulation of the words themselves. Melodic articulation, little vocal gestures like we heard. The tuning, it's not always in tune with the piano, the intonation, the phrasing. Melodic variation changes from verse to verse. Does it have a pickup to it, da-dum, or does it just go dum? The syllabic flexibility. Is the music shaping to the text, or the text shaping to the music when you go from verse to verse, where you have the same melody and different text? Breath, where are the breaths? This is a flexible parameter. The intensification and release of timbre, and listen for small volume fluctuations, okay? And look at all these other things at the bottom. So what I've hoped to give you here briefly is a sense of new approaches to analysis of the Yiddish folk song. We will be enriching this project with new resources, with new, we're planning a series of film dialogues with people who have some analytical insight, where they'll sit with us as a group and we'll tape a discussion on specific topics to increase the range and the sophistication of analysis of this massively neglected aspect of one of Europe's great song traditions, the Yiddish folk song. Thanks. We need Judah.
I'm here. Thank you for the waiting, and thank you so much. I heard most of this, and I apologize for going back and forth. At this point, I will shift over to a quick response, which I hope will be quite quick, and then we'll go into conversation, which has already been very lively in the chat, and want to continue that as well. This is a fantastic, impressive, and deeply meaningful set of projects, and I encourage you all, if you haven't had a chance, to access them and explore their astonishing depth. In music, scholarship tends to both love and loathe company. Individuals need the space to develop their own ideas, and a community with which to share them. The community in turn builds on those ideas, and through this dynamic, a field arises. In this way, we often think of scholarship as a pursuit of building blocks. You research, you observe, you analyze, you write, you publish, you record, you archive, you repeat. The key to this format, or the key to formatting new creations, the key is to format new creations in forms that are compatible with others' needs. An article, a recording, a score, a book, and now a website, a Zoom meeting, and likewise other kinds of forms that have been described. When it comes to the study of Jewish Ashkenazic music, we see in these projects the new and the next connecting to the past on several different fronts, whether through the music itself, scholarly research and analysis methods, or a legacy of scholar performers. From the Ansky expeditions to Yivo, to Kisselhoff, Makonovetsky's manuscripts, to Baragovsky's collections, to the papers of Ruth Rubin, these materials both pave the way for future scholarship and in some ways direct that way forward. Thus, appropriately, the scholars at the vanguard of the field, the ones that we've seen here among several others, are also among those most invested in the health of that same field, and the traditions that that field deems important to preserve as well. Each vibrant project that the session's panelists have created thus seeks a balance between honoring the past, parsing it through a community of scholars, and improving public access in an effort to democratize that scholarship and to make it available. In doing so, as they all acknowledge, these works also need to connect to, and in some ways, improve upon past efforts by addressing the music's unique needs. All notably begin with an archive. And over time, they change and expand as the idea of the archive itself expands and changes, and the idea of community changes along with it. In the larger picture, it might be possible to see this work benefiting from the momentum generated through the fields of musicology and ethnomusicology. Collaborative projects of the kind that Crowder describes might have spiritual ancestors in the 1960s, with Alan Lomax's Cantometrics and Choriometrics projects at Columbia University. These projects sought to train citizen researchers to analyze the music of small ensembles from around the world along more than 36 criteria in an ambitious effort to reveal larger truths about music's relationship to human behavior. The citizen scholars, or perhaps citizen mention, that Crowder recruits have different skills and are already invested in the outcomes. But the philosophy that all can combine to, in a sense, recreate a repertoire from existing materials and to learn new things from this expanded set of materials makes it an interesting and intriguing descendant. Efforts to analyze ever smaller units of sound in larger quantities also has a long history. Going back to Alexander Ellis's sense system from the 1880s, which breaks up every tone into 100 equal parts, continuing to Charles Seeger's electronic mellograph of the 1950s, which allowed us to visualize sound for deeper analysis, and further into the world of microanalysis, limited mainly by the limits and availability of new sound processing, imaging, and presentation technology. Already in the late 1990s and the early 2000s, Slobin had been using these and other tools to explore not just folk song, but also the crests of the klezmer fiddle. And as with these current projects, this work appears both to contribute to new modes of scholarship, to help artists understand and reverse engineer techniques, and also to reinvent music and maintain values of transmission and community hierarchy. These projects also come at a time when interest in what's been described as world music analysis has been resurgent among music scholars, spearheaded in ethnomusicology by Michael Tenzer and others, and responding, in a sense, to decades of emphasis on cultural studies. Now refocusing analysis on the music itself allows a field to create its own organization, journal, and annual conference, all under the title of Analytical Approaches to World Music. The growth of the field shows that Yiddish song is actually in good company in feeling that its own internally meaningful analytical concepts have been understudied and underappreciated. And we can use these concepts to decenter Western terms that always seem to be the musical points of reference. Seen as a whole, moreover, it's meaningful to think in a very optimistic view. How might a concept such as Zingevdik or the structural scoop find a home in a lexicon of global music terms, where they might sit alongside other theoretical concepts derived from communities of music analysts around the world? Bieszynski's paper, meanwhile, shows a number of ways in which our conventional understanding of the music archive, aged musical material objects collected and stored in a physical space and only accessible to sanctioned visitors during limited hours and at the behest of archivists, is changing. Although the transition from paper to a digital format is time-consuming and costly, it improves access analytics. It preserves the original materials more effectively. It offers protection against catastrophic loss. It amplifies the archive's public footprint and the material that the archive deems most valuable. And perhaps paradoxically, it places the archivist in even greater control than before by expanding differentiation between what is available on a platform and what is not. For publicly open materials, such as the Rubin collection, the potential benefits are enormous. Anyone with a good browser can now curate their own journey into Rubin's life and research. Bieszynski also identifies group projects facilitated by video conferencing, which ideally can commute the severe restrictions on movement that COVID imposed over the last 18 months and reduce cost and time commitments in the process. These meaningful initiatives come in the wake of a kind of archival crisis, solutions possibly, where archives always seem to be woefully behind on processing due to shortages of staffing, technology, and money. To end, then, I offer a many-leveled question. What do we do with the languages that are developed through these projects? All of these presentations highlight a dedicated network of Yiddish musicians, musicologists, and philologists that the field has been known for historically. They are both the main participants and in many ways the primary beneficiaries of this work. Also, these digital humanities projects innovatively extend conversations that have been going on for decades. Just as importantly, these projects can also serve as instruments for democratization, giving the interested public new access to these conversations and thus expand interest. Making an archive public further expands the archive, as these presentations show, whether through trusting musicians to translate written records into digital notation and sound, or sound into style, or engaging experts to translate Yiddish manuscripts into English text, or boxed archives into a curated exhibit open 24/7. But this kind of scholarship also faces a dilemma of purpose between looking inward to recreate an immersive world that we can link into past practices and heritage, and looking outward to connect to broader scholarly conversations. Facing inward can be deeply satisfying personally and artistically, especially for those invested in the world that they create. And it can create new concepts for sharing across cultures. But it can also create insularity and obscure points of connection and reinforcement with those other people seeking similar goals outside of Yiddish studies. Indeed, in music, this has been a long-standing point of contention, made even more complicated by the extraordinary enthusiasm of inward-looking participants and the relative coolness of world music scholars outside of these circles. We tend naturally to move in the direction of positive reinforcement, voluntary engagement, and a shared sense of purpose. But what does that mean to the future of the field? Can these new and next projects change that balance? Or is it important for them to do so in the first place? While we see digital humanities projects such as these appearing to expand access, we have also been subject to the same rhetoric used by giant internet companies that have resulted in further division into digital fiefdoms. Thus, in some ways, I return to the beginning of my remarks by expressing admiration and awe for the creativity, ideas, and passion poured into these projects and the amazing progress that each has experienced as a result. And then I ask, what next? In some ways, by opening up the archives, these projects have become joyfully endless. But where are they headed? And in what ways can they inform Jewish studies and the general fields of music and digital humanities? I look forward in the rest of our time to a meaningful and interesting conversation, and thank all of our panelists for their incredible work.